and most welcome to our fourth episode of Unlocking Data series, where we uncover everything you need to know about personal data sovereignty in Web3 ecosystem, including topics around data ownership in the metaverse. In the coming episodes of this series, we shall also be covering interesting topics of how you can earn from trading your data and also truly owning your digital data. Isn't that super fascinating? Well, the fourth episode is named Data Integrity for the AI Industry, and this is a hot topic today. Well, for this, we have our new guest on the fourth episode. Well, I would love to introduce you to John, and we'll talk about him in the coming time. Well, we have also Mark, who is the founder of Ethium, and he has been regular on our series, so you know him. Well, welcome to both of you guys.
Hi, everybody. I think you would have all seen me on this show a few times now. So I'm Mark Paul. I'm the founder of Ethium, and as you know, Ethium is building the world's first decentralized data brokerage technology, and this has use cases in enterprise, consumer. So in this show, we talk about specific topics related to our technology, and we like to bring on guests. So with that, I'll hand over to John, who I know for over 6 years, and John.
So much like Mark, I started as a software developer, mostly in tech startups. I think my first engagement with big data was in a Swiss boutique investment firm, which I helped co-found. There we used 10 years of stock data from all over the world to try and make stock predictions, investment decisions. But then after that, I think my first modern AI, projects was at Life Letters, where Mark and I met. The CEO of Life Letters wanted us to do a proof of concept in the area of a health assistant. And the idea was that the health assistant would use the DNA data that we had with our clients, and try and determine health outcomes, predict any kind of health issues potentially from that, and try and guide clients and patients through that interaction. After that, I did some freelance work with drone image recognition. That was focused initially on Southeast Asia, in terms of there were these Southeast Asian organizations that were trying to track poachers, forest fires, rare animals. So the idea was to try and do recognize these various aspects from drone imagery from above, which had been done manually before that. Then I also did some natural language processing in chatbots, trying to onboard healthcare patients from a mental health perspective. Also, Mark and I crossed paths again at AI Australia, where Callum was creating a whole bunch of subsidiaries in AI Australia, like AI Consulting, AI Hubs, a few AI schools. And I was involved in creating strategy around some of those services, trying to, create an angle in AI innovation, like how do we innovate in AI. Also ran a lot of projects with some of the staff. They're trying to build AI capability. So one of the projects was lip reading for the hearing impaired. Another project was going back to the drone imagery, trying to improve on that. Another project was path finding and resource mapping, and a few others like that. Basically trying to create use cases, white papers, and proof of capability. Yeah, that's pretty much it.
Thank you, Mark and John, for those wonderful introductions. I'm sure this conversation is going to be fire, and I would hand it over to you guys now.
Thanks, Anita. All right, John. So I thought what we'll do is we'll just have a conversation about data in AI, specifically like data integrity and the importance of data integrity in the AI industry. So I thought maybe you could give us an idea of the types, like just based on your experience and what's happening in the industry right now. What are the types of data that are like the hot data sets that are used in AI right now?
So as you know, my experience has largely been in financial data. And to get financial data, quite often you need to buy it, and you just need to spend a lot of money to get data that is actually going to be useful. So at Aniso Partners, which I helped co-found, we spent a lot of money on data via Thomson Reuters. And that was probably one of our, I guess, competitive angles, the fact that we were willing to spend a large amount of money to get quality data. From the drone imagery recognition, we used a lot of free data, but that took us to a point where we really needed to make our own data or buy data, because if you're doing a convolutional network, side images are not going to help you, but they're so fragile in some ways, those convolutional networks. They're not going to help you recognize, say, wildlife from above if it's a side picture. So you need to really generate those images yourself. And as you know, deep learning, convolutional network is deep learning, right? Requires a lot of data, a lot of those images to be able to do any kind of useful prediction or predicting what that particular animal is. As you alluded to, data is big now because the primary, I guess, the most successful machine learning out there is using deep learning, and deep learning requires a lot of data. Whereas other types of learning, for example, reinforcement learning or genetic algorithms, less so. I think there's actually a lot of potential in those other areas in reinforcement learning, primarily because the data in the deep learning side is already being taken and monopolized, and it's very hard to get, right? So my, I guess, angle has been, oh man, it's really hard to get this data. How do I get some trusted data that's trustworthy? How do I get my own data? It's really hard. What other opportunities are out there? I need to look for something where I don't have to rely on that data anymore because it's so hard to get.
You need lots of data, and at the moment, what's happening is there are people who are selling these data sets for AI training. And then in your reinforcement learning example, I believe you said that you had to. Did you say you had to create your own data sets as well?
Yeah, I mean, with reinforcement learning, I guess the way I would approach it is it's more humane in terms of I would look at a particular situation, see what data is there. I don't have a big enough data set for deep learning. I'd go, what sort of causal outcome do I want? What's creating this behavior? And then I would create that function within reinforcement learning that the AI has to match to, right? So reinforcement learning, not always, but it would help me get around that aspect of not having enough data. But I'm using my own fallible human reasoning to go, what's the causal outcomes here, and then create some sort of function based on that. Whereas deep learning would create that for me. It would say, here's the data. Let me just do an example. Let's say I'm trying to track a pandemic, right? Yeah. If you have the pandemic data, deep learning is going to say to you, okay, this is going to give you the insights if you have enough data, and say, these are the vectors, this is what's been passed on, this is the danger, these are the insights. If you don't have that, you've kind of got to go, oh, I don't have that data. What could this be being caused by? And in some ways, that's much less, probably statistically, is not going to be as accurate as if you had that data in the first place.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. It's almost like it becomes subjective, right? Based on what you feel like the results should be.
And there's good and bad in that. I mean, human beings are very good at creating. We are causal machines. We're very good at trying to, and that's everything that, like, even the way we talk is all about an object and what that object has done or created. It's very causal, right? So our whole intellect is based around causes. So we can quite quickly come up with some sort of reasoning behind what caused what, but that is very subjective, obviously.
Yeah. Absolutely. So on that example again, John, like in the domain of access to data. So typically, people who are training machine learning models, are there any like open and free data sets or a go-to repository of data sets that people could use?
I mean, absolutely. There's a huge number of free data sets out there on all different topics, but they're limited in at least in my experience. So when you're using ImageNet or various other recognition systems, they are using all of those free images out there, but they're very limited to kind of play systems, not real systems. So for example, in the image example, the images are very low resolution. The images aren't labeled correctly. The images are in the wrong direction, right? As I said, They're from the side, not from the top. So that, in my experience, that free data is often not enough, right? And there's a reason why it's free.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
It's because we can't get any more value from it, so people have given it away.
Yeah.
So from my perspective, and I know we're going to end up leading to this, right? But there's two ways we can go. We can spend a lot of money, or we can try and involve the whole world in creating data sets that we can all use. And involving the whole world requires an incentive. And that incentive can potentially be that the incentive is there so that people will give data, and we need to reward them for the giving of that data. And we need systems that will help provide those incentives and will help track the use of that data and help give the provenance of that data. It's your area, not my area. My area is more AI, not so much the blockchain side. But that's obviously one really cool usage, or one thing that I'm always thinking about. How can I get that data? How can I reward the people for giving me that data? And even how can I, once I create the model, going along this path of provenance, and I give that model to other people, how can I be rewarded for the usage of that model? So again, it's that ecosystem. It all ties in, right? The data flowing in, the usage of the model, all within an infrastructure.
Yeah. No, that's perfect. I mean, that's kind of where we will take this conversation into on how we do that end-to-end life cycle, unlocking data, making it accessible, enforcing privacy-preserving technology, rewarding the model builders. So I think we'll lead into that. That's a really good topic to kind of open up. So on that note, John, would you say if the data set is an open and free data set at the moment, we have established that maybe the data quality is not very good. So it has to go through some curation before it's available for AI. And then on the opposite end of the spectrum, we have maybe people creating very expensive curated data sets. So it's almost, to me, we need a sort of a middle ground there where we collect data from the world, but in a structured way, in a way that the way it's inputted it's conforming to certain standards that we can then say, you know what, this is a better quality, direct from origin sort of data. Would you say that's kind of where we're heading into?
Yes, exactly. But I'll tell you why I think it's important. Is because that middle ground is affordable for all the innovators out there and the startups. As a startup, you can't say, look, I'm going to spend $100,000 a month on data, right? So in order to create innovation in this field, I think you're going to need some sort of middle ground where there's high quality data that you can create real business value out of.
Yeah.
So for me, that's the important bit, that catalyzing new businesses, catalyzing innovation, catalyzing new breakthroughs. And that barrier to entry is really high at the moment to get good quality data.
Yeah. No, so we call those, the wall that's created by data brokers, right? So if you look at Ethereum, that's our whole objective, is to create decentralized data brokerage technology, break that wall, allow more data to flow through to the startups, to the social good platforms, to the researchers, to really build these open, innovative products. So I think that's one of the main goals that we have, and I think that's what we see. One of the biggest use cases for this is AI. So what we also wanted to talk about is how the intersection of blockchain and AI. Now, we've already established that AI needs a lot of data. At the moment, you're going to data brokers, or you have very poor public data sets. And I feel this is where blockchain comes in. So John, what is your understanding of the intersection between blockchain and AI? And then I'll give you my thoughts as well.
Do you remember that story where at the beginning of the internet days, the only people making money were the modem makers? Right, not the actual anyone else. I feel like at the moment, AI and blockchain, the people who are making money are all the journalists who are writing about it. Right, there's just so much hype because people see it as, potential, amazing potential. But then all the people writing about it just kind of dragging in jingoistic terms and trying to join them together. Where I see I mean, there's so many interesting points. We covered the bit about actually getting data, as in trying to create incentives for the creation of data, rewarding people for adding data, rewarding people for creating machine learning systems which use that data. The other important aspect from my point of view is I'm not sure whether I want to use the integrity of the data, but when you have really rich and valuable data, then it becomes a target for theft. So very important from an ethical standpoint is if you've got private data that you make anonymized so that you can create business value out of it, especially from a healthcare perspective, then you will need to have that data that's really protected, right? So you want to protect the data from theft. And the other kind of interesting bit, but not pushing as many red buttons, is that you want to make sure that the data that you have is actually creating the appropriate predictive outcomes.
Yeah.
So that's kind of more from a technical point of view. Is that data correct? Is it labeled correctly? Where did the data come from? Can we check that data? That's going to give us the right kind of predictive outcomes. But then the other aspect is we need to protect people's data. And how do we do that? Presumably, we're going to do it in a system that's made for this sort of protection, that's blockchain and similar sort of cryptography.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, I can tell you my view on the intersection. So this is something I've always been thinking about, right? And yes, I think you actually touched on many of those points. So first is the unlocking of data, to go to the broadest possible audience and to get structured data in, and then to protect the data. So if you're in what you're talking about, that the type of encryption we use to store it, where you store it, don't store it in a single location because that becomes a massive honeypot for attack. How do you distribute that data storage? But at the same time, how do you distribute with an encryption that is not centralized, right? And in Ethereum, we're looking at per user encryption. Every user data set is encrypted with their keys. So even if it's attacked, it's almost gibberish unless you have a key of a user. But at the same time, the challenge we have is if we want to use decentralized storage as a ways to mitigate an attack, then we need to be, how do we be regulation compliant? Like, do we store it in EU? Do we store it in data centers? Or do we use IPFS or Filecoin, which is completely decentralized? So we've created a layer called the regional decentralized hubs, and which aims to abstract all of this, and we're working heavily on that. But to come back to the point on the one of the biggest use cases of blockchain and AI is, I feel, the integrity of the data. So when you capture the data, you can sign the provenance of it, and you can trace the lineage of it, right? So in the example of healthcare, if you are training a model to detect disease or based on a data set from a bulk set of individuals, you want the AI that's actioning the model to make an objective decision. You want to ensure that the data was never tampered with from beginning all the way to the training. Because if you don't do that, the way I see it is the best the AI could do is make some recommendations, and then we have somebody coming in to action those recommendations. In a way, it's a form of centralization, but it's also, now we have intermediaries who need to get involved, right? So I'm still talking probably way ahead in the future, where all data that's flowing into these AI model building hubs, if you could think of it, is guaranteed to be authentic and guaranteed from a blockchain tech perspective, not guaranteed from a centralized person stamping an approval on it. I feel like that, to me, is when AI will reach its full potential, because now we have data flowing and it can action objectively based on the data. What do you think of that, John?
Yeah, well, there's so many topics you covered. I don't think we should get too hung up on centralization and decentralization, right? A business is a central repository of knowledge. I don't want to create what you've created. I want to use your services. Already, in some respect, I don't want to decentralize your services because you have an expertise in that area and I want you to solve my problem.
Yeah.
Right. So I think it's interesting. Did you read is his name Moxie Marlinspike's recent article where he was talking about blockchain and Web3 and so on? It's interesting. I think it was provocative, but I think the lesson I got from it is not get too hung up on everything must be decentralized. There's always a balance. But getting back to what you said, that I think the challenge has always been the challenge in blockchain, the connection, not blockchain AI, but we'll get to blockchain AI, but the challenge in AI in blockchain was the connection to the real. Like if I'm trying to track lamb meat from the pasture to the table, then there's a point that I have to get the data from the lamb onto the computer. That point there is a risk point, right? So with AI, less so, right? Because we're all in the digital realm. So, but we still need to create systems, or you need to create systems in this case, which locks down those gaps where there is with the system is. I mean, for example, I heard again in this article that NFTs, that you could, if you know the URL endpoint, you can go change it. So the actual image itself is not in the blockchain. Everything around it is, but not the image. So to translate that to the AI side, it's like we need to get more and more of the mechanism of interacting with those AI models and so on within the system, so you can actually track it. Not it's safe within the system, but then it's not safe where the actual research is done or whatever. And that's another topic, though. You actually want the ML modelers to be cleaning the data. So it's kind of like the data. There's no raw, pure data. There's still a long process of cleaning that data. Wait, there has to be some of this aspect of very free-form creativity where I'm changing the data to get what I want.
Yeah. So no, I fully agree with you. So yeah, the obsession with full decentralization, yes, that's also dangerous, right? You need to find a middle ground. And a couple of points that are very interesting, we can go into that, is one, you mentioned from the farm to table example, somebody still needs to load that data into the first system. So how do you make sure that's untampered? So that's a very interesting problem. It's almost like a black spot in integrity. So with I guess with humans, you could imagine a future where the data is coming from sensors within you, right? So from the point of it leaving your body, if you look at your body as the one that's emitting the data, you could encrypt it in certain ways that is untempered. But that's, some of the insights are also not directly coming from your body. It could be, again, in health, you go to see a doctor, your doctor's created the diagnosis. Now we want to take the diagnosis and put it on. So at some point, there is an on-ramp which is centralized, if you could say it that way. And I think that's okay. So that's a really interesting topic that we are always thinking about how we can solve. The second, in your example of NFTs, yes, that's true. So NFTs, when you mint an NFT, your actual image, if the NFT is an image NFT, it doesn't live on chain. It's actually off chain on decentralized storage, or sometimes even centralized storage. But the metadata location and as well as the hash of the image is on chain. So even in that example, if somebody goes and swaps out the image in a centralized location, you can verify the hash and say, oh, it's been tampered. So what's interesting is we have taken that use case and applied it to data. So in Ethereum, we have data NFTs, which is exactly this. You upload a data set, we hash the data set, store that on chain, the signature of the data. But the data is actually off chain because you can't store that much of data on chain, obviously.
Makes sense.
But upon let's say you are an AI organization and you want to buy or get a bulk data set, you can verify the hashes. So the off-chain data can be verified against the on-chain hash. So that way you know the integrity is good. So that's I think the real value of NFT tech in AI. I think that's a really super cool, interesting use case as well.
You mentioned data from the body. And I mean, I call that environmental data, right? Because it's not just the body. It might be weather systems. It might be climate, whatever. It might be drill cores. That, to me, is really the interesting part. Actually, it's a little bit boring for me going and auditing, say, financial systems. Environmental data is so open to creating interesting things from. So that's an obvious, easy win, right?
Yeah.
Environmental data comes straight in. It's raw, it's perfect.
Yeah.
And you can do interesting things with it.
Yeah. No, that's in fact, some of our favorite projects, like Chainlink, for example, is one of my favorite projects, and does exactly what you just said, right? You can have all of these sensors collecting environmental data, and Shea has this concept of decentralized oracle networks, which means multiple people are actually getting the feeds from this, and then you're ensuring that the feeds match. So which means you're even ensuring that the sensors are the data that's been pulled from the sensor APIs are untampered with. So, and this is really cool and interesting to me because what you're creating is that life cycle, right? From collection all the way through to some use case at the end with as less intermediaries as possible. And I think you touched on this, that's key. It's almost impossible to say this is going to be completely decentralized. So what we try to do is reduce the amount of intermediaries needed to authenticate data. And I think that is a very important aspect to it if you want to unlock a lot of data.
Well, there's fewer, the surface area certainly for attack is reduced, right? And just thinking about auditing systems, it's not so much AI, but anytime you're doing any sort of audit or tracking, you want that to be untampered with.
So, John, I think we've covered all the topics we wanted to talk about. Are there any closing thoughts? Just maybe not about blockchain, but just where you feel AI is going, and what are you most excited about in AI?
You know, the funny thing I think is just it feels to me like AI is somehow disappearing. It's become, and it's being talked about by many other people. It's very important. And certainly in this country, it's not emphasized as much as it should be. You know, I think you'll find that anyone who spends a large amount of money tends to get the value out of AI. So all of those countries and companies that do that, whereas we don't really have a culture of spending a lot of money on things like AI. So we're always going to be a little bit of a backwater here, I think, because we're not spending the resources that we should. AI requires much more investments, much more like scientific method compared to other, say, normal software development. And we just don't tend to do that much here. It's all about kind of turning the crank, easy wins, low-hanging fruit. But nonetheless, I do feel like AI is becoming part of the bedrock. You know, it's just accepted that parts of AI are just going to be thrown in to your organization. And you yourself, you've used external services. I think you were using Cognition or something like that from AWS.
Yeah.
So those sorts of services are going to become better, and people are just going to be using it without even knowing that they're using it, I think, which is, it's good for giving AI, giving value to the world. It's bad for innovation, certainly in my case, because it makes it harder to innovate. There's not enough money. All the big companies are doing all the exciting stuff.
Yeah. No, I think I was going to ask you that. So it's almost looking like, because the data has been monopolized by these big companies, now the AI models and all of that's being also monopolized. So what we get to use at the end of the day is, you know, AI as a service, which is just a black box.
Yeah, it's a crude black box quite often, but it's just too expensive, not just from a data perspective, but you need to iterate with that data.
Yeah.
You know, you need to spend a lot of time with that data, trying things out, and it's expensive. And getting a team to do that is really hard unless somebody wants to throw millions at you.
Yeah.
Which is challenging in this country.
Thank you so much, guys. It was a lovely conversation, and I'm sure our audience will get a lot, out of it. If there are any closing thoughts from both of you, please feel free to share them.
So firstly, huge thank you to John. John and I have worked for many years, and obviously I think we're going to continue to work together on a few things. So first, thanks, John, for joining us.
Good to see you guys. Yeah, it was good to be here. I think it was good to cover some of these topics. I mean, Mark, you've kind of been expanding in this area for quite a while. That I actually would come to you for many of these things now, not just in the blockchain area, but also for AI, just because you've had different experiences and explored different areas. And it's, I think, a very interesting and fruitful area to explore, and it was good to talk to you about it.
Great. Thank you, guys.